floods reached up to 3 meters.
It's called the world's dirtiest river.
The megacity's toxic air.
Jakarta is sinking fast. The city is dropping about 12 centimeters each year, and if nothing changes, it could end up underwater soon. But Indonesia has a bold plan to save its capital. They're building the Garuda Sea Wall, a 40-year, multi-billion-dollar project designed to keep Jakarta from becoming a modern Atlantis. But will it be enough? In this video, we will look into how Indonesia is building a giant seawall to stop Jakarta from sinking. The reasons why Jakarta is sinking. You might be wondering how bad Jakarta's sinking issue is for a wall to be needed. But best believe Jakarta's sinking problem is no small issue. This city is basically on a steady journey downward, and it's happening fast. Jakarta is actually sinking faster than any other major city on the planet.
That is home to 10 million people, but the Indonesian capital, Jakarta, you can see it down there, is one of the fastest sinking cities in the world.
One major reason is the abundance of tall, shiny skyscrapers and endless rows of malls. You'd think the buildings themselves would be fine, but all that weight actually puts a lot of pressure on the ground, and Jakarta has an insane number of these structures. For shopping malls alone, it's said to have more than any other city worldwide. Then there's the skyscrapers, which make Jakarta rank up there with major cities globally. The weight of all these massive structures presses down on the soil below, squeezing it tighter over time. But that's not the only reason the ground here is sinking. You have to stay tuned till the end of this video so you don't miss out on any detail. There's also a serious water problem. Jakarta has had water shortages for years, and it's not just because of the growing population. Because the city doesn't have a good enough public water system, people have to rely on groundwater, which is pumped up from deep underground. That means thousands of deep holes are drilled every day across the city to get water, weakening the land even more. This constant drilling leaves the ground like a piece of Swiss cheese, full of holes and much weaker than before. Over time, this makes the ground settle down further and faster, contributing to Jakarta's sinking problem. Then, there's the issue of the rising sea level. Jakarta sits on the northwest coast of Java, right next to the Java Sea. With rising global temperatures, the water levels in the Java Sea are going up, reportedly by around 200 centimeters each year. So while the city's sinking on its own due to those buildings and groundwater extraction, it's also dealing with this extra threat from the sea. Jakarta's proximity to the sea has always made it vulnerable to floods and tsunamis, and now it's getting worse. Annual flooding costs the city an estimated $133 million in damages, and that number is expected to skyrocket to around $637 million in the coming years. Experts have even said that if things keep going like this, about a third of Jakarta could be completely underwater by 2050. In certain areas, more than 4 meters of land has already disappeared beneath the sea between 1997 and 2005 alone. To tackle all this, the Indonesian government is taking drastic steps. For starters, they've come up with a plan to actually move the capital from Jakarta, which is on Java Island, over to the island of Borneo. This new capital city, called Nusantara, is set to cost around $34 billion to build, and will feature a futuristic design meant to avoid the issues Jakarta is facing. On top of that, the government has banned the extraction of groundwater in Jakarta. But perhaps their most ambitious idea is the construction of a massive seawall. The idea for the seawall actually came up back in 2010. It was planned to be a gigantic structure that would protect the city from the rising sea, but of course, not everyone was on board with the plan. Environmental groups and some local politicians weren't thrilled about it, arguing that it would mess up the local ecosystem and disrupt the livelihoods of people who rely on the sea for fishing and other work. A coalition called Mal di Sagoro, which includes environmental and social groups, raised concerns about the potential problems this massive wall could bring. They argued that it might not actually stop the land from sinking and could even worsen coastal flooding. Plus, the wall could cut off some areas where people go fishing, putting their livelihoods at risk. There were also concerns about how it might damage the coastal environment, disrupting natural habitats and reducing biodiversity, which are important for both people and the ecosystem. To put an end to all this, the idea of a seawall was brought up. Get ready for the most epic moment of the video, the construction of a giant seawall. Even with the opposition, Jakarta's situation hasn't exactly improved since 2010. In fact, things have only gotten worse. Now, over a decade later, the government is bringing back the seawall idea with a plan that's even bigger than before. Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs.
Everything will be fine. No need to worry. Your investment in Indonesia will continue to be safe.
Erlangga Hartarto has been talking about how important this wall is to Jakarta's survival. He pointed out that certain parts of the city are sinking by up to 25 centimeters each year.
Jakarta has come to a standstill. Muddy waters up to 2 meters high in the city center have forced many government offices and businesses to close.
Mainly because of that constant groundwater extraction and the ever-growing urban development. In his view, the seawall isn't just helpful, it's essential for stopping the land from sinking and keeping the sea from flooding Jakarta over and over. The project is huge and will require 3 phases to be completed, stretching well beyond 2040. Just the first 2 phases are expected to need about $10.5 billion in funding.
The government has launched a massive program to save it. Andy Saputra has more on this epic undertaking.
But the costs for the 3rd phase haven't even been estimated yet. When complete, the seawall, named the Garuda Sea Wall, will span a whopping 25 miles along the northern bay of Jakarta and stand 80 feet tall. Its placement is strategic, covering both the east and west sides of Jakarta's bay. To make the project more appealing to private investors, they're adding some interesting touches to the design. Instead of just building a plain wall, they're turning the top into a new urban hub, complete with everything you'd expect in a city. Imagine a bustling area with an airport, a harbor, a toll road, residential buildings, industrial zones, waste treatment facilities, and even green spaces. All of this will take up around 4,000 hectares, and that's not all. The plan includes the construction of 17 artificial islands. These islands, once completed, will make up an entirely new section of Jakarta that could house around 2 million people. The goal is to have both ends of the seawall done by 2040, although the work on a 30 kilometers long river and beach dike along Jakarta's coast is already underway. This dike project actually started back in October 2014, with a target completion date set for 2030. It's meant to extend and reinforce an older dike that had failed during Jakarta's devastating flood in 2007. The Garuda Sea Wall will include a huge freshwater reservoir to store rainwater and river water from Jakarta's 13 rivers. This could make a real difference for residents, especially since Jakarta has relied heavily on groundwater for years, which has only worsened the sinking problem. With this reservoir, the hope is that people will be able to rely on cleaner water without draining the city's groundwater so much. It's like building a whole new water source right inside the walls of the seawall. To be real, this project comes with a huge price tag. The estimated cost is around $10.5 billion, and it's obvious the government doesn't have that kind of money just lying around. So they've been looking at private investors to get involved in the project. This partnership approach means the government will work alongside private companies to fund and build the seawall, making it a public-private venture. According to Erlangga Hartarto, Indonesia's coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, there are already several interested investors willing to put their money into the project. Several key investors, including companies from Japan and South Korea, as well as Dutch engineering firms, have shown interest in Jakarta's Garuda Sea Wall project.
So what do you think, all these very fundamental situations are the biggest reason for Japan's investment and interest into Indonesia?
Seeing it as both an infrastructure challenge and a real estate opportunity. The Dutch government has already contributed to feasibility studies, leveraging its expertise in water management. Additionally, private Indonesian real estate companies are interested in developing new residential and commercial zones on and around the seawall, making this a collaborative venture aimed at both protecting Jakarta and tapping into valuable urban development potential. It's not hard to see why, because a project of this size, if successful, could really be a game changer, attracting even more interest and investment into the region. Actually, parts of the seawall project have already started, even though it's still early days. Back in 2014, they held a groundbreaking ceremony for the Garuda Sea Wall as part of the larger National Capital Integrated Coastal Development (NCICD) plan. The NCICD is basically the master plan for the entire coastal development project around Jakarta, and the seawall is one of its biggest pieces. So while there's a lot still to do, work on protecting the coast has been moving along, just in smaller steps. The Dutch and South Korean governments have even chipped in, contributing $19 million for feasibility studies to assess the project's long-term potential. These studies will focus mainly on the second and third phases of the seawall construction, looking at how effective the project will be in the future as Jakarta's challenges grow. But as big and bold as this seawall plan sounds, it's got plenty of critics. It gets interesting from here. You don't want to miss it. Criticisms against the construction of the seawall. Environmentalists, local groups, and even some politicians have raised serious concerns about what a giant wall around the city could mean for Jakarta's ecosystem and for the people who depend on it. For one thing, there's the worry that blocking off the sea with such a massive structure could end up turning Jakarta Bay into a kind of giant sewage pool. Right now, 13 rivers flow into Jakarta, bringing both fresh water and, unfortunately, a lot of pollution with them. If the seawall blocks the natural flow of these rivers, that pollution might have nowhere to go, leaving it to just build up in the bay. Parid Ridwanuddin, who works with the Indonesian Environmental Forum, has been vocal about these concerns. He's warned that the wall could actually make things worse for Jakarta by trapping waste in the bay and failing to address the main cause of the city's sinking, which is the overuse of groundwater. In his view, a more natural approach might be better for Jakarta's future, such as replanting mangroves along the coast and restoring riverbanks. Restoring riverbanks could also reduce flooding and make the waterways cleaner and healthier for people who live nearby. In response to these criticisms, Hartarto has tried to assure the public that the seawall won't just be a big concrete block cutting off Jakarta from the sea. According to him, the seawall design includes special doors that would allow water to pass through, which would hopefully prevent the bay from turning into a giant stagnant pool. He's also stressed that environmental studies were done to look at how the wall might impact local ecosystems, including mangroves and fish populations. This wasn't just a construction project slapped together on paper. They say they're thinking about the environmental side of things too. There's also a team of people involved in coordinating the project, and Hartarto emphasized that all parties need to work together to make sure it's done right. Meanwhile, Indonesia's Marine Affairs and Fisheries Ministry is keeping an eye on the project's spatial planning to ensure it stays on track. They're responsible for overseeing how the wall and other development along Java's northern coast are mapped out and built. It's clear that a project like this doesn't come without major questions and challenges, but with the continued rise of sea levels and Jakarta's ongoing land subsidence, the Garuda Sea Wall project is being pushed forward.
Others struck in 1906, 1957, 1989 and 2004. Felt across even the San Francisco Bay Area, the 2004 quake, which originally struck the Parkfield area, had a magnitude of 6.4. Is something worse happening very soon? According to Thomas Jordan, the director of the Southern California Earthquake Center, the answer is a straight yes, making the whole of California go into a frenzy. Although on a normal day, the announcement of the possibility of such a seismic hazard will not send most Californians into panic, the fact that this one is said to be occurring in the southern part of the fault, which is locked, loaded and ready to go, excavated the long-buried fear since 2 years after 9/11. Thomas Jordan's descriptions of the situation are not helping, as he was downright truthful, explaining the bleakness and dreariness of the coming catastrophe in all its shades. For a scientist to paint the event like that, it must have been that way, so people would have thought. Let us now consider why his prediction is that weighty and why we should believe him. Whenever an earthquake struck, it was thought to be an act of God, perhaps for sins committed knowingly or unknowingly or by self or others. But we now know that earthquakes are not caused by sins. Rather, they are phenomena that would normally occur on a planet as big as the Earth. A little bit of what humans do plays a role too. Does that now mean it's even predictable? In the early days of science, nobody thought earthquakes were really predictable. But since the Japanese catastrophe, that's changed. Meanwhile, it still does not mean quakes can be predicted accurately. By looking at some characteristics that cut across the board, quakes could at least be predicted. Sometimes it could be a false negative. Sometimes it could be a false positive. Considering the magnanimous destruction that could be apportioned to people living within a concerned area, the first and most important thing to have better is better expertise in seismology. We're talking about such knowledge that could make one predict with near accuracy what will happen. Thus, in that sense, a false negative is desirable, at least whenever the seismologist is confused about the situation. But in the case of this one, the risk is high, and the pattern is well founded. Since 1857, no major release of stresses has been recorded in the now dangerous southern part of the San Andreas Fault system. You would remember that the San Andreas Fault marks the boundary between the Pacific and the northern plates. Both plates have been moving approximately in the northern direction, but one is moving faster than the other, the Pacific plate. This means the stresses between the two plates are constantly building up inexorably. However, this is different for the northern region. In 1906, through the catastrophic strike of about 7.8 magnitude in the San Francisco Bay Area, some of the stresses on this fault were released. More than 80 years later, some were also released during the Loma Prieta earthquake. Unlike the first one, this one was simply 6.9 magnitude. Except for the 1994 Northridge event, which has been accrued to another fault system, the southern fault has never had any means of releasing stresses. For such a fault system to have withheld an enormous amount of stress for a long time, for all we know about the northern fault, its outburst will be extremely catastrophic, if not perpetually disheartening. It is imminent. But just how big will this earthquake be, and how devastating would the strike of this earthquake be? You may have seen the movie titled San Andreas, produced by Beau Flynn and directed by Brad Peyton and Carlton Cuse. It's a calculative attempt at imagining how big the earthquake could strike San Andreas. One thing about the movie is that it posits itself as being rooted in science, and many have adopted its view. This might be why fear lives on in California after Thomas Jordan's announcement. In the movie, a magnitude of 9.0 strikes San Andreas. Scientifically, this is near to impossible in the concerned part of the world. It does not mean it cannot, as some people are more than ready to claim. Rather, it's just that it's limited to only special places on Earth, the regions of the Earth where subduction happens. Subduction is when one tectonic plate is forced to go below or beneath another. That is, one stays on top while another stays under. As it's been properly observed, this is not the case for Southern California, where two plates slide past each other. According to reputable scientists and scientific organizations, the possible maximum earthquake magnitude that can strike along the San Andreas system can never be anything more than 8.0. Meanwhile, the probability that such a thing could happen in the next 30 years in this region is 7%. Remember that this is a scientific analysis based on probable cause. It does not mean it's 100% certain, as it could happen the next day. That apart, still in this region, for an earthquake of magnitude 7.0, only a 75% chance exists that it will strike. Of course, a 75% chance is quite dreary, and one should be wary of it. It looks highly likely. Though it's easy to consider earthquake magnitudes of 7.0, 8.0, and 9.0 as just within the same rank, this is not the case. Let us explain. A magnitude of 9.0 releases 32 times more destructive energy than a magnitude of 8.0. Compared to 7.0, the difference is voluptuous, as a magnitude of 9.0 releases about 1,000 times more energy than a 7.0. This is easing to a certain extent, since only a magnitude of 7.0 looks likely. Moreover, the whole sequence of events discussed in the movie is untrue. Take, for instance, how they portray the San Andreas Fault as being beneath the ocean. Not at all. The San Andreas Fault is not beneath the ocean, and for that sake, any slippage along it cannot displace water in such a way that everything will result in a tsunami. The opening up of the massive chasm is also straight from the world of imagination because the plates are sliding relative to each other rather than away from each other. One should watch movies like that for what they're for: entertainment, not real science. Whatever the case may be, whatever the magnitude, there's no denying that none of the three mentioned as likely in the region is desirable, as the devastation will be beyond the ordinary everyday onslaught we often see. Or it could be the first of its kind in America if the 8.01 strikes. How devastating would the strike of this earthquake be? Knowing what underlies something usually serves in handy. Thus, to understand this phenomenon, we need to see what it was like when it first happened. Now, we're talking about the 1857 Fort Taehyung earthquake. It started with a rupture that wickedly swept from near Park Field in the Cholet Valley almost to Wrightwood. That's a distance of about 300 kilometers. On the other hand, in the Carrizo Plain, horizontal displacements of as much as 9 meters were observed, leading to 1 fatality, which does not mean that it wouldn't have killed more people, but rather that that was the available number present in the area, at least considering the gravity of what's been mentioned up there. This has made many compare it to the San Francisco quake in 1906. As for the San Francisco quake, only the fault break was longer when we mention the displacements. Certainly, those of 1857 were longer. The property loss was so heavy and disheartening, especially considering the relative wealth of this period we're discussing. To most people around this area, their farms were their main sources of income, as there was no Silicon Valley. An army base 7 kilometers away mourned some of its distinguishable properties. Moreover, 2 buildings were declared appropriately unsafe, while about 3 were reportedly extremely damaged, though habitable. Trees were forcibly uprooted about 20 kilometers west, and buildings were destroyed between Fort Taehyung and Elizabeth Lake. Unfortunately, 1 woman was killed during the collapse of 1 adobe house at Gorman. Also recorded was a strong shaking of about 1 to 3 minutes. From Sacramento to the Colorado River Delta, instances of sighting, fissuring, sand blows, and hydrologic changes were reported. In the beds of the Los Angeles, Santa Ana, and Santa Clara rivers, and at Santa Barbara, ground fissures were observed. Sand blows struck at Santa Barbara and in the floodplain of the Santa Clara River too. One report describes sunken trees possibly associated with liquefaction in the area between Stockton and Sacramento. San Diego, Santa Barbara, Isabella, and the south end of the San Joaquin Valley witnessed a change in the flow of streams, or what you can otherwise call springs. In the Santa Clara Valley in Northern California, changes in the flow of wells were also reported. And the scariest of all, the waters of the Kern, Lake, Los Angeles, and Mokelumne rivers overflowed their banks, which could have raised concern about flooding nowadays. Moreover, aftershocks preceded the main shake by 1 to 9 hours. It was felt in Marysville South to San Diego and east to Las Vegas, Nevada. Many aftershocks also ruffle some feathers, but 2, one happened on January 9th and the other on January 16th, were heavy enough to be felt widely. Although histories are good, as Heraclitus of Ephesus has said, no man passes the same river twice, for he is not the same man and it is not the same river, meaning that we cannot project all of the 1857 catastrophes to today. We then need a new analysis based on possible scenarios. To our aid comes the US Geological Society. Bravely, to understand and be able to predict the event, US Geological Society survey modeled a 7.5 magnitude event with slippage of 2 to 7 meters, all calculatively chosen to represent the long stress release drought in the fall. They figure out what would be the most effective in any likelihood case are construction straddling the fall. But in this case, there are few such constructions following the Alquist-Priolo Fault Zoning Act. That means other things will be affected. So, in the place of construction, other things will be affected. Among those are 966 roads, 90 fiber optic cables, 39 gas pipes, and 141 lines. According to their release, over $33 billion would be spent. the money diverted into it would weaken the world economy as trade may stagnate. Old houses are also susceptible, no matter where they are. But modern houses are not really. Not all old houses are susceptible, since some of them are secured with modern-day anti-earthquake gadgets. Most old houses don't have it, thus many of them will be affected. The aftermath will be even more bloody as fire will ravage the whole area. We know this will happen because it's the same thing that happened following the Northern Ridge earthquake. This happened because gas mains and main water pipes become severe. In the light of today, that will be wickedly enormous. The present forecast says that the damage from the fire will be more than the damage from the initial shock. Death tolls would be high. An estimation sets it at 1,800, and that's quite sensible, provided people do not evacuate at the last stern warning. Then everything will be returning back to normalcy once more. But as soon as the regenerative process begins, dangerous and unheard of aftershocks will frequent the area and its surroundings. This will happen because the tectonic plates would have been destabilized. For example, Christchurch, New Zealand was struck by a 6.2 magnitude event in 2011. Since the event, it's recorded more than 10,000 aftershocks. That's more likely for San Andreas, too. Moreover, Los Angeles may also suffer drought for a while, as 88% of its water is from aqueducts from the Colorado rivers, Owens rivers, and the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, all of which cross the San Andreas Fault about 32 times. If the big one strikes, the water supply for more than 22 million people will be cut off. To assuage this, water from other areas will have to be diverted. Well, that could be the beginning of a large-scale crisis. What is the government doing to prepare for the big one? Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti has asked for proposals to protect the water supply and develop alternatives if a quake blocks the aqueducts. His ideas are actually manifold. He wants the waterways to be strengthened to develop an emergency supply for firefighters using reclaimed and ocean water. Motivating this swift movement is the San Francisco Bay, which is ahead of LA in building robustness that would allow water to continue flowing when a quake strikes. Having long forethought a possible water crisis scenario, the East Bay Municipal Utility District built backup tunnels, stronger pipes, and new waterways to secure the continued flow of water from the Sierra Nevada in case one of its 3 main aqueducts is blocked. Costing more than $350 million, the initiative was funded by water customers, bonds, and government grants. Moreover, under San Francisco Bay, a new water tunnel has been built by the San Francisco Bay Commission. This is not the only doing of the commission. They also installed a specially designed pipe that crosses the Hayward Fault. Connected by accordion-like joints, the pipe is flexible as it can swing and flex even as the quake moves the Earth in 2 directions. The projects are part of a $4.8 billion effort funded by a surcharge on water bills. Considering the total speculated amount used by San Francisco Bay, it's easy to know why Los Angeles has been undertaking the project hard. Take, for instance, the fact that a lot will be spent on water, and much more will also be spent on proposals to retrofit thousands of vulnerable buildings and make sure the internet is still accessible after the quake. Wouldn't much more be even spent after the big one hits? Especially in case many things that could have been protected are destroyed by the quake. The best place to start is the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Built by William Mulholland centuries ago, the aqueduct crosses the San Andreas Fault through the 5-mile Elizabeth Tunnel under the mountains north of Santa Clarita. The faith in it has come through the fact that it's stayed for years. But as we know, it's probably because it's never witnessed a major quake. Experts say the San Andreas Fault could move as much as 33 feet in a big earthquake. That way, it can slice the pipe, dam it, and demolish some of its concrete sections. To prevent that, authorities have listed 2 solutions: building a wider, stronger tunnel and using electricity to pump water over the mountains in LA. But the Department of Water and Power has lacked resources to study the myriad retrofit options until now. Nevertheless, the DWP has already begun sketching out an interim solution. They placed a 3-foot wide, strong plastic pipe through the tunnel. If the tunnel collapses, the plastic pipe might keep enough of the passageway intact to keep some water flowing through. The mayor of Los Angeles has been in and out recently, seeking the best way to prepare for the whole thing. He's asked city officials to present him with a proposal before the end of July. Things that should be included are plans on how to mitigate against the seismic damage, and which aqueducts should be left and which should be replaced. In addition, he's also asked the 3 major corporations in charge of LA Water to work together to have a formidable front in the event of a crisis.
Do you think this seawall will stop Jakarta from sinking? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Click on the next video displayed on your screen. You will enjoy it.